on this episode of the Masai Mara podcast, we are delighted and honoured to welcome Jake Grieves-Cook. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you very much, Steve. Pleasure to be with you.
Jake has an enormous backstory to tell us about his relationship with Kenya and with the Masai Mara. Why don't we start at the beginning very briefly, Jake, and give us a quick update about your early life and your relationship with Kenya and how it evolved.
Well, I grew up in Kenya. My parents, having been through the war, decided to move to Africa. I went to school in Nairobi, and then after university in England, I joined the Block Hotels Group, which was really a pioneer company in terms of developing tourism in Kenya. So they had some of the first safari lodges, and they had the New Stanley Hotel and the Norfolk Hotel, Nyali Beach and Sinbad in Malindi, and Kikarok and Samburu and Treetops. So I worked with Block Hotels for about 10 years, sort of man and boy. I started off as an assistant manager in Kikarok Lodge in the Mara in 1972, which is quite a long time ago. And I was eventually managing director. And then we had the awful incident of the Norfolk Hotel bombing. We rebuilt the hotel, but in 1981, I decided to have a change of scene and went to the UK, taking my family. But then, and I was involved in tourism there with Kuoni Travel, which at the time was the leading long-haul tour operator. And then I went back to Kenya and was involved in developing the conservancy concept. Having worked for 10 years with Block Hotels and seen the sort of startup of tourism, I had a few ideas, and I felt that tourism could be used to do more for conservation. I think in the past, tourism had just taken advantage of the fact that there were these amazing wildlife areas. But as the human population grew, and as areas that had previously been wildlife habitat were settled or were developed, used for agriculture, the space for wildlife was shrinking. And it was pretty obvious and evident to me that the national parks, with the exception really of Tsavo, were relatively small and would become islands cut off from each other. And that there was a need to look after dispersal areas and wildlife corridors so that the animals would still have space to live. So I was then involved in setting up, we established Gamewatchers Safaris first, and then we worked with local communities to see if we could use land outside the national parks as wildlife habitat, and then to use small-scale tourism to pay for the costs of running the conservancies that we were involved in setting up. So that was really how I first got involved in the conservancy concept and the wildlife conservation.
And that spans several decades of from far distant past to the part of Kenya that I remember. I think we crossed paths in probably the 90s. Would that have been when you were setting up the first Porini camp around Amboseli? Would that be right?
Yes, I think you were involved in starting the Ecotourism Society of Kenya, and I was also joined that and became the chairman, and carried on and expanded that, and used the conservation, the Ecotourism Society to develop a standard for safari lodges and camps. We had these we had the eco rating system, gold, silver, and bronze. And I think there's probably over 100 or more camps, and in fact, probably considerably more than that now. A large number of the camps and lodges in Kenya have an eco rating given to them by the Ecotourism Society. So yes, I think we came across each other then, and that was when we started the idea of the Perini camps. The idea being to have small scale camps which would not have a big footprint and a big impact on the environment, and to use those camps to follow the sort of principles of ecotourism, which was really to to seek for a way to be sustainable, which is a word much bandied around these days, but essentially to use small scale tourism to benefit, first of all, the environment and the habitat and the wildlife species, but secondly, the people whose land is being used, to generate an income for the people whose land is used for wildlife tourism, and to create jobs and livelihoods, especially, as well as paying rent. And then thirdly, to create an experience for the visitor. So it's a sort of threefold thing. One is the habitat and the environment. Two are the people who own the land and should benefit from it and should have the opportunity of being involved in running it and earning an income. And thirdly is the experience that the visitor has, a form of tourism that enables people to enjoy getting close to nature without damaging it.
Yeah, I think it's a shame in a way that ecotourism and Kenya don't get a greater visibility, a better press. Unfortunately, Kenya's got into a bit of a downward spiral with, too many camps, too many visitors, too much overcrowding, and yet we forget that there's this incredible history going back, 30 years or more now, of environmental responsibility. And as you say, an awful lot of camps and operators have got those accreditations and do act responsibly. And I think it's great to be able to give them a bit of a shout out, don't you think?
Well, I think that's right. I think that there are many people who have made a positive contribution, and there are many safari companies that are operating in the right way. And that was the reason for having the eco ratings. We wanted to be able to recognize businesses that were, running their companies in a way that could be seen to make a positive contribution in those areas that I mentioned, in terms of looking after the environment and being responsible, in terms of looking after or making opportunities available for the local communities and local people, including training and bringing people into the tourism arena, whereas previously they might have just been observers from the outside looking in, watching it happen. We now have very many safari guides who have completed their training and have achieved the rating that's given by the KPSGA, the Kenya Professional Safari Guides Association. And there are very many families who are earning an income by some of their family members being involved in tourism. And so I think there are many businesses that are doing things in the right way. And I think that in a way, the ecotourism ratings have helped to give that recognition.
Yes, I remember we always used to define ecotourism with leave nothing but footprints and take nothing but photos, but it seems to have been left bobbing in the wake, doesn't it? And the tidal wave of human population growth and land use change and tourism numbers and of course camps and lodges as well. In your day in Kikarok, I mean, how many other camps and lodges were there? 4 or 5, perhaps?
Well, when I first started there in 1972, Kikarok was actually the first lodge in the Mara, and it was the only one at the time. It was the Mara Serena was the second to open, and Governor's Camp had been operating, I think, since 1970. So there was no other safari lodge, and there was a camp, Governor's Camp. I think the key thing to remember is that tourism can support conservation, and without tourism, conservation can become very difficult because there is an income that tourism provides, but we need to operate within a certain framework. What goes wrong is when everybody just piles in and you have more and more and more and more camps and lodges cropping up all over the place. There's been some research done recently, I think, by the Mara Predator Group, who've shown that there are fewer lions where there are large numbers of camps. I think a lot of that has to do with the vehicle traffic, because where there are a large number of camps, there are vehicles coming in and out and in and out. And if you can reduce the vehicle traffic, and if you can reduce the size of the camps, and if you can spread them out, then it can work very well. And then you can also move into areas where there could be tourism, but there isn't any tourism. I think if one is simply trying to stop camps and lodges and stop tourism from happening, you're going to lose out in terms of conservation. But if you can spread tourism into areas where it's not happening at the moment, then you can enlarge the amount of habitat that can be protected. And there are fairly simple ways of achieving this. Within our conservancy model, we have a very simple formula, which is no more than one tent per 700 acres. That effectively means no more, on average, than one vehicle per 1,400 acres. If you've got, say, four people in some vehicles, 2 people in some, 6 in the others, 4 people per vehicle is essentially 1,400 acres per vehicle. Now, 1,400 acres per vehicle and one tent per 700 acres, and no camp larger than 12 tents has been our policy. That really does reduce the amount of intensive tourism in a particular area and spreads it out. So it's relatively simple to do. That's a formula that we have adhered to in all the conservancies where we operate. If we could get that recognized as the norm, then you wouldn't be able to have any more camps springing up in the Mara or in certain areas, because there's just too many there already. And that's what's happened in the conservancies that we operate in. We have a limit. There can be no more camps, because the only way there can be more camps is by enlarging the conservancy. So it is possible to reduce the intensive form of tourism. It also gives a better experience for the visitor, because the one thing everybody complains about is too many vehicles at a wildlife sighting.
Yeah, I mean, quite a number of important points that I'd like to pick up on. Thinking back to your early days in the Mara, just as an example, the ecologists will tell us that the wildlife numbers were, from then to now, collapsing at pretty much the same rate that the human population was and the cattle population were increasing. So there's a correlation over time, isn't there, that conservation is difficult in the face of a human tidal wave, and there's a tension to get right there. I think as well with the proliferation of camps, there are people perhaps who think that being entitled to set up your own camp is a way of helping the local community. But of course, there's a dilemma there, that as you're helping the community and as you're making money out of your business operations, so wildlife and conservation is suffering on the other side. And there are people who think that balance may have gone too far. What's your own view on the proliferation of camps and people and how to maintain the equilibrium in the longer run?
Well, I think it's absolutely right that the more camps you have, the more the experience for the visitor is spoiled, and it also has an impact on the wildlife. So it's simply a question of trying to see how tourism can be managed so that the numbers are kept within reasonable limits. And one way, as I say, is if somebody wishes to start up a camp, they need to have enough land in which to operate. Then if the park should have management plans that show the carrying capacity in terms of accommodation units and facilities. And if somebody wishes to have a camp in that area and create employment, they should also ensure that there's enough land to go with it. So they need to be leasing or paying to utilize enough land for the game drives to take place. I mean, one other thing is to look at alternatives to the standard sort of game drive idea. Careering all over the place in vehicles. People go off-road with large numbers of vehicles. It creates all kinds of tracks. It leads to it leads to erosion of the soil. As soon as it rains, you get all these different tracks acting like sort of rivulets or mini rivers. And so one wants to keep the vehicle density spread out. And one way of doing that is simply to have a formula which says you cannot open another camp unless you've got additional land. So you have to have an agreement with a community that they've got the space for the game drives to take place. But as I was saying, alternatives to game drives such as static observation posts, by salt licks or by places that are visited by animals, where you're not just driving around all the time. Not everybody wants to be driving around, and you can have a more rewarding experience, slow down a bit, get closer to nature, absorb the sounds, the sights, the smells. And if you've got a guide who knows their stuff, and there are many excellent canyon guides, they can enrich the experience by explaining to you what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and tell you about the experience that you're having. Whereas just going into it cold, for many people who are not already experienced safari goers, their whole experience can be enriched if it's interpreted to them. And so static observation points, hides in the right place where you can view the animals without them being disturbed, I think is another way to go. There's an increased number of lodges and camps now that have hides where people can just watch what's happening in front of them.
Yeah, I think the whole experience has erred on the side of being rather frenetic in pursuit of either migrations, large herds, or large carnivores. Probably not helped a lot by what people see on TV with the amazing wildlife films that have been made over the years, which they obviously want to emulate on their phones. It's a bit difficult to do that. With the experience of just being mindfully in amongst the wildlife. I mean, in your own camps, for example, you barely need to go anywhere, and there's wildlife in and around all the time. If you have the right kind of low impact properties, you don't need to go frenetically chasing around, do you? But the conservancy model, let's turn to that. I think you can claim legitimately to be a bit of a pioneer in that whole thing. It seems to me to have been incredibly successful, not just in applying the low impact formulas that you've described, but in the whole decision-making process of involving private investors with an ethical approach to life, in partnership with local communities, but primarily to the benefit of the wildlife, without which the tourists are not going to come in the first place. Talk us through how the whole conservancy movement came about and how it's grown so much.
Well, I think that we started off really in Selenke, and that was an area that was really pretty well semi-desert. In fact, on the old maps, that area was called the Nyeri Desert. And what we wanted to do was engage with the community so they could see that there was an opportunity for them to earn an income from their land, other than depending entirely on livestock. Now, livestock is very important to pastoralist communities, and I certainly would not wish to suggest that we do away with livestock. In fact, that if the old system where livestock would graze heavily in one area and then move on is actually something that's beneficial for the diversity of the plants. It all goes wrong when people are forced to stay in the same place, and when the herds build up in numbers and then crash when there's a drought after excessive overgrazing. So the livestock have a role to play, and it's very similar to that of the large herbivores anyway, such as buffalo and eland and all the grazers and browsers. The wild animals that move through the environment, they tend not to be rooted in one place. There are some species, as we know, which will stay. I mean, impala, which are both grazers and browsers, some of the time they'll be eating grass, and some of the time, when there's less grass, they'll be browsing on leaves. But there is a degree of migration that takes place. And so what I was trying to discuss with the Wazee of the community was what they remembered, and they remembered large numbers of animals there, rhinos and elephants, which had pretty well gone. And I also remembered it because when I was younger, I'd camped in the Selengay area and seen it for myself. There's a thing, shifting baseline, where people remember what they remember, but little do they know that it was very different um, slightly earlier. So we all agreed that there had been large numbers of wildlife. They felt that they had not really benefited from the presence of the wildlife. Amboseli National Park was formed, and they were to some degree excluded from using it, and that had been an important area for grazing for them. And so what we discussed was whether we could use an area of the group ranch, the Selengay group ranch, and have it set aside for the wildlife. The people voluntarily moved their bomas, which in any case were temporary or seasonal bomas. They moved the bomas out from a designated area of about 13,000 acres. And we put in 2 boreholes so that there was water. In the past, there'd been year-round water in the Selengay Lugga, which is a dry river. The reason there'd been water there was that the elephants used to dig and create small wells. And of course, the elephants had been chased away or had gone, hadn't been seen for 20 years. So by putting in a couple of boreholes, there was water there, which attracted the wildlife. And slowly we saw the elephants come back. Cynthia Moss, who is an absolute expert on elephant behavior, suggested that she knew that Selengay had once been an area that the elephants went to, that if we tried to do a sort of equivalent of a paper chase, but using elephant dung from Amboseli National Park into the conservancy, it might lead some elephants to come back and to discover that we had a waterhole there. And we did that. We chucked out elephant dung from the park all the way up to the conservancy from the back of a pickup. And sure enough, some elephant bulls arrived. And then later we had small family groups coming. So essentially the initial stage was to employ rangers and to have the area protected so that the wildlife came back, became habituated to moving back again. The community embraced this idea. We started our small camp. We trained the staff to, in the kitchen, and the idea was to have it almost 100% drawn from the local families, apart from perhaps the chef or mechanic. And over a period of time, more people were trained, and it's almost entirely staffed now by people from the community. So that was the first one, Selengay, and it's been going for a long time. Now there are elephants there, very large variety of species. I think probably more individual species now in the conservancy than in the national park, which is interesting. I mean, species you don't see very often in the park, like kudu and gerenuk. So that was the first, and then we expanded the idea to the Mara with Olkinye, Olare, Mutoroki, Naibosho. And we've worked also trying to support other people operating conservancies such as Olpejita. And so, yeah, it's been something that started off, and it gained the support of the local communities, because without this being a partnership, they would not have wished to continue having that large area set aside for wildlife. And now we have very many guides who've been working for years and years.
Yes, and from every measure, very successful, both from the community perspective and from the wildlife, and presumably from the business point of view as well. So it's definitely a win-win-win. How do you see that developing, though? Because the tide of human population is not going to slow down in the short term. Is the conservancy model sustainable in the way that perhaps other land use has not proved to be in Kenya?
I think the big challenge, as you mentioned, of course, is increasing human numbers. but also the value of land. Land values are rocketing, and many landowners are tempted into selling their land, which is it's an easy way to get money quickly, but of course that money will disappear, and then they're left landless. So we've always tried to encourage the communities not to sell their land, hang on to the land. It's an asset that they own, and they earn an income from it, albeit a smaller income than if they just simply sold the land. And I think they've responded to that. They've wanted not to sell their land. They agree that selling land is not a good idea. We've been forced ourselves to chip in and buy land in order to prevent it being sold out to outsiders who would use it for other, for developments that are inimical to wildlife conservation. But the whole idea is to keep it as something that is leased and belongs to the community. But the difficulty is, of course, that you may get a landowner who's very happy with the income he has, and he has two of his family employed. But when he dies and he has 10 children, 1/10 of the income split between 10 of them makes it less attractive. So the difficulty is really how can holding land to be used for wildlife conservation be justified when there are so many owners? How do you increase the income? And so that is the challenge, and it's one that is difficult. So as long as the livelihoods are there, then it makes sense to have your land in a conservancy. If there's not enough income creating livelihoods, then people will look for other ways. And what are the other ways? The other ways are property development and shopping centres or selling for housing. I think that high value tourism can compete with agriculture, but it can't really compete with property development.
But it does mean that access to the world's wild spaces and access to Kenya's wildlife has become more and more expensive. I mean, the Mara particularly has a conscious policy of increasing prices in order to try and control numbers. The conservancies, just because of all of their costs and commitments, have to be expensive. So it's no longer something that your average person watching TV in Europe or America could say, "Oh, I'd like to go on safari." This is a serious financial commitment, isn't it? And even for local people within Kenya, although they get discounted rates, it's still a commitment. How do you see that financial aspect playing out?
Well, I think that it becomes very expensive in areas where there's a tremendous spectacle, particularly. And there are some areas where the attraction is more the landscape. And of course, there are very many other species other than the big five. And so, trekking, walking, getting close to nature, rather than necessarily the spectacular views. And where you have the spectacle of the big cats, the migration, perhaps there is scope for higher charges, just as, for example, with gorilla viewing. And so there are different forms of tourism. So first of all, as I say, the spectacle, and maybe it doesn't have to be viewed in a way which simply involves game drives. Perhaps larger numbers can be accommodated in some form of viewing scenario, like the old treetops or the Ark, where you have large numbers of people. There is a spectacle to be observed. You can observe it without having to drive all over the place, because there it is smack in front of you. So I think there needs to be new forms of tourism developed, and these are indeed happening. People are doing that, But as you say, it is becoming more expensive, especially for overseas visitors, and the cost of getting there, the airfare, the travel is also expensive. And so I think different forms of tourism um, to cater for different markets.
In the world of ornithology, birding tours around the world are very much a thing. And you would expect naturally to find bird hides. It's a very normal way of people both observing and taking photographs. So I think your idea of a more static wildlife experience is quite a viable one.
Yes, I think there are other examples. One should always have a look and see what other people might be doing better. I mean, birding in Kenya is fantastic. There's 1,000 different species. It's one of the top birding destinations in the world. Many of our guides now are very, very knowledgeable about the birds. In fact, they even enjoy bird watching themselves. Um, so, if you look at a place like, for example, Trinidad, Trinidad is has a famous birding center called the Asa Wright Center, where people, particularly from North America, go in very large numbers just to photograph birds. They've encouraged the birds through feeding stations and that sort of thing. But you can encourage birds by making sure the right plants are there. You don't need to sort of put out bird tables with food on it. It can be done in a more natural way, you know. But there are so many birds, and a lot of the camps you can see very many different species just walking around the grounds of the lodges, and many people miss this. But where the lodges have got guides who are able to take people on nature walks, it can enhance the experience considerably.
I think it is quite remarkable how the Kenyan guides this generation have become so much more knowledgeable and so very good at communicating and interacting with their guests as well. Um, do you think there is a new generation of indigenous Kenyans who are picking up the, the, the gauntlet and running with it? Now people like you and I are coming into our latter years.
Oh, yes, very much so. I think many of the Kenyan guides are fantastic. I mean, I enjoy interacting with our own guides in terms of sightings and things people have seen, and between them, there's a huge wealth of knowledge in terms of the observations they've made and things they've seen. Um, so many experiences they've had, and as I say, many of them enjoy it. I know um, there was a Maasai friend of mine from one area who went to attend a wedding of another guide in another area, and suddenly he rushed off and had his binoculars and was looking at a bird that he'd never seen before. Everybody, everybody thought this was quite funny, but in fact, he was very enthusiastic and wanted to see that bird, and that was in his spare time. He wasn't taking tourists to see it. So I think there's a genuine interest and love of wildlife that the more you're exposed to it, the more you begin to appreciate it. And this is part of the whole idea of slowing down and getting more in the moment and getting closer to nature. You see the tourists arrive, they're often quite stressed out. This is their holiday, they're getting away from work, the rat race, and they're still frenetic. But once they've slowed down a bit and begun to see the bigger scene around them and see how the animals behave, they enjoy it far more, and especially when they've got a guide who can interpret it to them. Otherwise, they'll miss and not realize what's happening.
Well, Jake, I'm sure you could share very many more stories of all of your time in Africa and helping with both the conservation and the development of tourism in your own very unique way. But I'm going to say thank you very much for this chat today. And hopefully we can pick up another time and share some more intimate details of your involvement and your success stories, it has to be said. I think you should be proud of what you've done, both with ecotourism, with conservation, with game watchers and the camps, and I'm sure the communities would recognise that.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much, Steve. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.